Okay, I think I'll lead it. Welcome to Sprint 99. Let's get started. So I'll do the sprint statistics. Carol will do community update. Dan is the UI. Julian and Adam providers. Tina automate. Joe platform. Alberto REST API. Chris documentation. Although I think Steve Ream has taken that. Next. Okay, so we had 312 PRs merged this past 2 weeks, and that's kind of in line with the past couple of sprints, and it's a normal distribution. And the same goes for how the PRs merged prior to this last couple of sprints. It looks pretty much the same. And as far as bug types, you can see there's 36% were bugs and next enhancements, and that's pretty much like we see sprint to sprint. And again, there wasn't much change here. ManageIQ Classic, other issues went down, which is good. And that's typically what we see for that, and same for the others. And now we have Carol for a community update.
Thank you, John. So for the community update, it's quite short this week. We just, the main thing is the Hammer release candidate 1 is now available. So we're nearing the official Hammer time release. So good job, everyone. And with that, as we wind down towards the end of the year, don't forget that there's a lot of events coming up at the beginning of next year and throughout the year as well. So if you're interested, these two calendars, I find it very useful myself to find cool events to attend or speak at. If you're interested to attend and present something at these events, for example, the wonderful work you're doing on ManageIQ. And if you don't know where to start, you can always talk to me. I have some experience getting proposals submitted and accepted. I think last couple of years I've spoken at 7 or 8 different events, and I might have submitted like 10 to 12 proposals, and so good acceptance rate. So if you want some tips, I'll be happy to help, or even just to brainstorm on topics and things like that. And that's it for this time. And thanks. And next slide, please.
Right. On the UI side, there's the PR counts. You can see highest number was bugs. We're trying to, wind down Hammer and fix a bunch of regressions and things like that. So that's why you see that count so high. Some of the bugs are listed here. So we weren't able to download utilization and bottlenecks reports, so that was taken care of. Also on the bottlenecks, the timelines weren't being rendered properly, so fixed up that display. We've seen some fixes in the past for other buttons not working when you're looking at a list of items that are related to some other item rather than their main list. And so custom buttons is a little bit special, so that was also broken. We fixed that. In the log depot settings, in some cases the password was disabled, so that was taken care of. And for Google Cloud Engine validation, all the other providers have a default validation, and Google Cloud Engine only had one, but it wasn't called default. So that was like an exception. It was different than everything else. So that was broken. That was taken care of. On the enhancement side, the product features, which are basically on the server side, are now available in a local storage on the browser, so the client can access them when needed. And that's great. So that doesn't have to keep going back and forth to the server all the time. In V2V land, you can now edit orphaned plans. And sometimes the orphan plan, the mapping might be gone, so you can actually take care of that and replace that with a different mapping. Also, there's a minor enhancement for the public cloud networks where the tenant, the target tenant doesn't necessarily match the cloud tenant. So now everything is displayed with the cloud tenant name so that it all matches up. Next slide. So there's where the you can edit the plan, and there's where you get a message, and you can either go create a mapping or use an existing one. Next slide. And this is just where the cloud tenant is shown instead of the target tenant. That's it for UI. Next slide, please.
All right. So for providers, we had a much more active sprint compared to the last one. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the breakdown. So OpenStack had by far the most merge PRs, followed by Azure, and then a sprinkling along the rest of them. We did some cross providers work around a particular connection state. So that's where a lot of those two and one PRs across those came from. Next slide, over to Julian for cloud.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Thanksgiving sprint. So we've just got a few cloud improvements this sprint, mainly bug fixes. So one was for Amazon, where in the settings file, which you can now access via the API, we had to change from symbols to strings. That was causing a few bugs, so we've fixed that. And Google and Azure, basically, we were returning nil for the connection state, but now we just return the string connection. So that's kind of going to stop a few more bugs. And over in just Azure land, some of the regions weren't accessible for insights, and so we're now returning an error as opposed to just not returning anything at all. So that's it for the providers. Back to Adam for infrastructure.
Thank you. So for the OpenStack side, they added parallelization for their underlying connection handler. So now OpenStack refresh goes to 11. They updated infrastructure refresh so that when you added a cloud provider, it would also refresh the underlying infra provider. And some preparatory work for multiple AMQP endpoints for events. And they also fixed validation for the provider AMQP event endpoint. Next slide. And on the Ansible Tower side, updates to support Ansible Tower 3.3. They changed the way that the standard out was being returned. So now we're compatible with Ansible Tower 3.3. Lenovo Martinez added a lot of graph refresh specs. Graph refresh was merged a sprint or two ago, and now we're following up with more test coverage on that side. For containers, Kubernetes and OpenShift, Yakov fixed an issue with container project memory rollups. We weren't actually aggregating the memory across the nodes for container projects, so now that's fixed. And we also fixed canceling a container scan job. Before, if you canceled it on the UI, it would just hang and never actually cancel. And next slide, and over to Tina for Automate.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning. We had 21 PRs merged this sprint. For V2V, the transformation plan task cancellation status attribute was added in a previous sprint. This sprint, Fabian modified the V2V Automate code to use the new attribute to trigger the task cancellation. Fabian resolved the transformation plan request denial issue and fixed the transformation plan request approval message. For dialogues, Bill Wee resolved an issue with auto-generated service dialogues created for orchestration stack provisioning. Previously, service dialogues created for orchestration stack provisioning included a required dialogue entry for cloud tenants. Since not all orchestration stack providers support cloud tenants, dialogue validation would fail due to the non-existent required field. Drew Yu fixed the service dialogue dynamic dropdown multi-select default value issue. Next slide, please. Object ownership is important to retirement. Orchestration stacks were missing the owner group and tenant. Drew added a schema migration to add the owner information and made changes to set the stack ownership during provisioning. Service retirement as a request creates a task for each retirable service resource. Drew resolved an issue where a task was being created for service templates, which are not retirable. Lucy resolved an issue where the container smart state analysis failure marked the container as compliant. And Billy Fitz continued his work on updating our Automate methods to use embedded methods where possible. That's it for Automate. Next slide, over to Joe.
Thank you, Tina. This sprint, the platform team merged 17 PRs. There was some work done by Joe R. and Keenan to progress the work to move to Rails 5.1. Julian added an enhancement to raise an event when a new user is added to the database. I added support for the Apache module ModAuth TSS API for the OpenShift build, which will replace the soon-to-be deprecated ModAuth curve. Keenan added a performance optimization by doing more work in SQL instead of Ruby. Nick C. updated the appliance console version to bring in enhancements to the existing database backup support that was done by Jerry, Nick L, and Nick C. And Greg T addressed an issue introduced in last sprint's dynamic product feature support. Next slide, please. For bug fixes, Julian fixed a 500 error that was being returned by the API when a tag without a classification was encountered. Keenan made a change to ensure connection status is always populated, and Yuri made a change to allow setting the retirement date for service or requesting retire now by a central admin. And lastly, a big hats off to Libor for removing the deprecated usage of the toe hat method from MIQ schedule. That's it for me. Next slide. And on to Alberto for the rest of the story.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so for the REST API, we had actually a couple of BZs fixed. Thanks, Joe, for fixing those. For the enhancements, we have by David here, the adding support for custom button events. So these are now exposed as sub-collections for users, tenants, and groups, and that was needed for a new API-driven UI screens. And that's just an example of the three gets for users, tenants, and groups, and the custom button event sub-collection. Next slide, please. Hey, David also did an enhancement to present the product features list. That's returned with the primary entry point and in the user's identity section. So as you can see here, we updated the users groups list to include what product features pertain to that, for each group for that user. So when you fetch that get API, you'll see the enhanced identity section with the MIQ groups there, the product features. And that's it for the API. Next slide, please.
Are you there, Steve? Okay. Well, Steve Bream was going to step in for Chris, who's out, but there's the information for the documentation. Looks like they did a lot of work, and that's it. So next slide. So that ends Sprint 99. Our next Sprint 100, we're up to 100, is in 2 weeks on December 5th. So that is all. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
The Centennial Sprint.
We should have a party, right?
Yes, we need
Cake.
a Centennial Sprint party.
Cake, 100, 100.
John has to handle